President Trump, former President Trump, made lots of headlines over the last weekend when he made in a campaign speech, went out and basically said that he told some story from his first term in office, and said that he told some people in the past that if NATO country didn't pay its dues, that if Russia attacked them, then he might not agree to defend them. Made all kinds of people all excited. And of course, everybody who's already an enemy of Trump jumped all over it. I haven't heard too much on the other side of it yet. And we're actually going to look at both sides of that today. And we have no person better than Ambassador Chaz Freeman, one of the best diplomats that we have ever had, and one of the greatest voices we still have on that today. We're grateful to have you on. Welcome to the show, Mr. Ambassador.
Glad to be back, Danny.
Well, let's just jump right into it because it's a hot topic right now. And first of all, I want to play the soundbite that Trump actually said, and then we'll talk about what he has to say about it on the other side.
The presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
Now, we're going to show you in a minute what the current president said about specifically about that. But first of all, I want to back up a little bit to last summer, where Biden had his own comments to say about this sanctity of NATO.
You can't tell me whether you're going to be able to go home tonight. No one can be sure what they're going to do. I'm saying as sure as anything can possibly be said about American foreign policy, we will stay connected to NATO. Connected to NATO, beginning, middle, and end. We're a transatlantic partnership. That's what I've said.
So President Biden seems to be saying that basically we should never leave NATO. We should stay there forever because it is sacred kind of the situation. Where Trump is saying it's more transactional. And in fact, actually, I want to play that second clip we have of Biden because he actually mentioned some of that before we talk.
Just a few days ago, Trump gave an invitation to Putin to invade some of our allies, NATO allies. He said if an ally didn't spend enough money on defense, he would encourage Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want, end of quote. Can you imagine a former president of the United States saying that? The whole world heard it. The worst thing is he means it. For God's sake, it's dumb, it's shameful, it's dangerous, it's un-American. And NATO is a sacred commitment. Donald Trump looks at this as if it's a burden. When he looks at NATO, he doesn't see the alliance that protects America and the world. He sees a protection racket.
So let's look at that, Mr. Ambassador. I mean, first of all, let's just kind of take, besides what was said by either one of those men, let's look at what NATO is. So NATO was formed in 1949 at the very beginning of the Cold War, when there was the whole Soviet Union and then the Warsaw Pact on one side and all of Western Europe and the United States and the Western world on the other side. And it was a big deal. So I think that it's probably reasonable to say that NATO made a lot of sense back then.
So you want me to comment on that?
Yeah. So,
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I thought you were going to run another clip.
Sorry.
Let me say, I think both Biden and Trump have it completely wrong. The only purpose of an alliance from an American point of view is to protect American interests. Trump seems to conceive of NATO as a kind of a mercenary operation. They pay us and then we go out and die for them. That is not what NATO is supposed to be about. Biden seems to think that NATO is eternal, but our interests reflect the times and the changes in them. We are not confronting the Soviet Union as we were in 1949. We're confronting a very different situation in Europe. Europe in 1949 was devastated by World War II. It is now back, a wealthy, powerful set of societies, now in a new structure, the European Union. And the circumstances are completely different. So I think they're both out to lunch on this. We should be looking at this in terms of our interests. And there, I think it's relevant that Europe is back as a major force in the world. Now, I looked at the reactions to the Trump statement by the crowd there, And I think there are two kinds of reactions to his statement. One by populists who are disgruntled, who believe the elite has lost interest in their interests, and Trump, those are Trump backers. And so they love it when he sticks it to the establishment. And that's all they're thinking about. They're not thinking seriously about U.S. defense and requirements. The second sort of people who welcome the Trump statement are, however, strategic thinkers. They ask why, when Europe is recovered on its own feet, can afford more defense spending than it does, why should the United States continuously say to Europeans, you need to spend more, but if you don't, we'll come and do it for you? What sort of incentive does that leave Europeans with to provide for their own defense? So the strategic thinkers say, very intelligently in my view, the periphery of our world, the peace of our world, should be defended primarily by those who are primarily threatened. Self-defense by Europeans is essential, and it's been lacking. And therefore, what Trump says, even though he may totally misunderstand NATO, it is not a protection racket. It is not a business in which you make a profit or other people have to pay for you to stay in the game. It is an alliance, supposedly serving American interests. And if that's the case, it does need to be adjusted. And I would argue that we'd be far better off at this point Europeanizing NATO. That is, putting a European in command of NATO and providing backup for it. That is exactly what we tried to do in Asia. That is, stand back and let those on the front line defend themselves. Require them to do that. Don't give them a free ride. Yeah. So I think Trump may be like the stop clock that makes sense twice a day. He may be right for the wrong reasons, right, but I think he's got a point.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up here a quote by another former president you may have heard of. You may remember him somewhat. Brother George Washington, who famously said, why by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. You know, we always talk about, George Washington being, first in peace and first in war and all that. And we revere him as the father of the country and all that. And it certainly rightfully so. And this is one of those big areas where I think that we need to revisit some of the wisdom that he talked about there, because it really reflects what you just said there. In a moment in 1949, it made sense for our own national security, our own interest, to have the NATO alliance, but under the conditions that existed at that time. And now the conditions are radically different. So why would we not want to change what we have to reflect the new conditions? That's what no one seems to even want to address, much less answer.
Let me make 2 points in response. One, George Washington was absolutely correct. Permanent alliances separated from the changing effect of the times on our interests make no sense. We should have our alliances under continuous review. Do they serve our interests? Are there alternatives that are less expensive in blood and treasure to them or not? That makes sense. The second point, however, I'd make is that the 20th century shows that Europe and the United States, North America, if you will, Canada, and the United States at least, are part of the same geopolitical zone. If we leave Europeans to their own devices and don't keep our hand in, they've shown on 3 different occasions that they will mess things up. World War I, we had to cross the ocean and redress the balance in Europe that they had unbalanced. World War II, the same thing. And the Cold War, in many ways, was a European contest, or a European-centered contest. Now, we had more to do with starting that than we did either World War I or World War II, both of which we tried to stay out of. But I would argue that, indeed, we do have interests that are transatlantic. We have an interest in the Europeans being able to manage themselves effectively. And part of that, by the way, history shows in Europe is that there has to be an organic relationship between Russia and a powerful Germany or powerful Western Europe. And Europeans want us there in part because if we're not there, Germany is too powerful. And it becomes, again, a threat. We've seen the French and Germans go at it on several occasions. We don't want that to happen again. So there are reasons for us to keep our hand in Europe, but that does not mean putting American troops on the front line. Europeans should be on the front line. And we should be prepared to help them if they need help. But we should do our best to ensure that they don't produce circumstances where we have to do that.
That would be the much more efficient and effective in American interest than what we're doing right now. But when you look at the other side of this equation that so many of the advocates of staying forever jump into is that the fear of Russia. They say, oh, even though the Cold War's over, Russia's still there. And so, the big bear could come clawing across at any moment right there. And oh my God, they're proving it in Ukraine right now. And I think that's really exemplified by this clip from former General Wes Clark.
You can't put enough adjectives on this to describe how treasonous such a comment is, how unfeeling, how insensitive to the fears of Europeans, many of whom have lived under Russian oppression. They know exactly what it is. This is a war of extinction against a nation of 40 million people to destroy the culture, the language, the history, and anybody who's associated with resistance to Russian occupation. So you could have 10 million people killed if Russia comes in there.
So first of all, Trump is a treasonous for even suggesting that NATO will pay its fair share, but pull their own weight. And then second, that, oh my God, Russia is going to kill 10 million people if we don't stop them, so we can never leave. What do you say to those two issues?
I say there's absolutely no evidence to support that. That is living in the past when the Soviet Union, which had a messianic ideology, was trying to spread around the world, and a fear of Germany, expanded into Eastern Europe and had satellites. For the last 30 years, since the Cold War ended, Russia has been in retreat. It has not tried to rebuild the sphere of influence in Eastern Europe that it had. What it has done is objected to the expansion, continuous expansion to its borders of NATO. And it demanded in 2021 a negotiation with the West, with the United States in particular, to do several things. First, neutralize Ukraine so it was not a threat to Russia, or for that matter, not under Russian control, and a threat to Western Europe or other Eastern European countries. Second, have a discussion of overall European security architecture to produce a situation in which everybody could feel comfortable, Russia and Western Europe. There was no unilateral Russian demand for their benefit only. And finally, of course, end the civil war in Ukraine between the ardent Ukrainian nationalists of the Western Ukraine and Russian speakers in the East who were being attacked because they had found conditions unbearable and had attempted to secede. But, Mr. Putin agreed to the Minsk Accords by which Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, the so-called People's Republics, would be part of Ukraine in a federal structure resembling that of Canada, where they'd have the same sorts of rights that Quebec does to speak its own language and have a good deal of local autonomy, but within the Canadian Federation. This was, Putin was prepared to accept the borders with Ukraine. I know what is all this stuff about he wants to take over Eastern Europe? I think Russia's got enough problems domestically. It is probably the most diverse country on the planet, with many, many different nationalities and languages and heritages. It's got enough problems managing itself internally, and to want to avoid additional burdens. And nobody in Eastern Europe wants the Russians on their soil. not the Ukrainians, not the Poles, who
Right.
have
Baltics or any of
become
them.
a formidable military force. I mean, Poland is spending 4.5% of GDP on defense, and it is heavily armed, interestingly, in large part in cooperation with the Republic of Korea, which has become a major arms exporter to Poland. So I think Wes Clark has got it totally wrong.
Yeah.
And it's
not the first time.
that is not the first time. No, but I mean, he's living in the past.
And lots of people live right there with him, and that's why they had him on there, because he speaks the same thing that a lot of people do. Now, I want to touch on the other half of that part of the equation, which is Vladimir Putin. Now, I'm curious, because I don't know when your career actually ended, but did any of your career cross over with Putin in any of his machinations? Did you have any interaction with his administration or personnel?
No, and in fact, I did not visit Russia until after the end of the Cold War and after the end of my career service. I served 30 years. I first went to Russia, Ukraine first, and then Russia in December of 1994. I had contacts with the Russians, mostly hostile during the Cold War. As the Cold War ended, those contacts became friendlier, and I actually developed some Russian friends. But no, I did not deal with him.
It's ironic, I think. I was going to say, I think it's ironic that you're one of those that actually was a Cold Warrior. So many of the people that are so virulently anti-Russian today were those who grew up all throughout the Cold War and are still stuck in that mentality. But you grew up in that same world, and yet you adjusted and changed with the changing of the times and the changing of the other side as well, to have an open mind instead of one that is closed back and formed in the 70s and 80s. So I thought that's interesting. But along those regards, so I want to play a clip about from the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, where he makes a number of claims. And then on the backside, I'm going to comment on what a lot of people are saying about it. But then I would really like your view as a diplomat who is skilled at knowing what leaders and people say in public and what maybe it means in the background for possibility for diplomatic negotiations. Gary, roll that clip.
I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification.
I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism, but how? How do you do that?
This question appears to be subtle. It is quite pesky. You say Hitler has been dead for so many years, 80 years. But his example lives on. People who exterminated Jews, Russians, and Poles are alive. And the president, the current president of today's Ukraine, applauds him in the Canadian Parliament, gives a standing ovation. Can we say that we have completely uprooted this ideology if what we see is happening today?
You don't control the entire country. You don't control Kiev. You don't seem like you want to. So how do you eliminate a culture or an ideology or feelings or a view of history in a country that you don't control? What do you do about that?
We have it all in writing. Neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. This, it turns out, can be done during the negotiation process. And there's nothing humiliating for Ukraine as a modern civilized state. Is any state allowed to promote Nazism? It is not, is it? That is it.
One of the things that really stood out to me about that was at the end of it, because obviously Russia is in a locked into a conventional war with Ukraine. So they want to win the war, just like Ukraine wants to win the war, and both sides are killing the other. But Putin specifically said the denazification, which most interpreted as meaning the destruction of Kiev and the Zelensky government. He said that can be discussed in negotiations, which, along with other things he said in that interview, make it sound like he's very much potentially open to negotiated end as opposed to winning militarily. Now, many in the Western media have said, you can't believe anything Putin says. He's just saying that. He doesn't want to negotiate, or he just wants terms of surrender. What do you say? What did you see in that interview, and what do you think is actually possible behind the scenes diplomatically?
Well, I think there were a number of interesting elements to that. First of all, this war began not when Putin refused to negotiate. He demanded a negotiation, and he demonstrated his seriousness by massing troops on the border with Ukraine. And it was the United States, Secretary of State Blinken, President Biden, who said there can be no negotiation with you. And when we stiff-armed him, he acted militarily, which we knew he was going to do because we were predicting it. So this business of he won't negotiate is nonsense. And it's even more clear that it's nonsense because he did negotiate under the auspices of the Turkish government and with the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. His representatives and the Ukrainians reached a treaty draft. They got an agreement. He just cited part of it, which was that the Ukrainians would not allow the extreme fascist element in their society to predominate. So he proved that he would negotiate. But I think probably the most interesting thing about that statement is that he has not yet moved the goalposts. He is sticking with his original declared objectives so far. But as things change on the battlefield, as the Russians cease to operate a meat grinder against Ukrainian human wave tactics favored by the new defense minister of Ukraine, apparently, and begin to go on the offensive themselves across the broad division between their troops and the Ukrainians, the situation is going to deteriorate from Ukraine's point of view. And they've run out of manpower. They have internal divisions now, which are very obvious.
Yeah.
No one knows how long Mr. Zelensky will remain in power. And he's apparently bought a $17 million apartment in Dubai to add to his mother's villa on the Red Sea and his villa in Tuscany, and God knows what other properties he has abroad. He's got a bolt hole. I'm not predicting he will use it, but it's clear that there is a lot of disorder in Kyiv at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Putin is not talking about dominating Ukraine. He's still talking about neutralizing it. And he made that quite clear in that conversation with Tucker Carlson. But the question now is, at what point will he feel that he's entitled to move the goalposts? And those goalposts have, not included seizing what was once part of Russia, namely the area around Odessa, and depriving Ukraine of the Black Sea coast that it has had since 1922, when Lenin gave that property, that land, to the new Ukrainian state within the Soviet Union. So I think we're at a very difficult moment. And I note that his statement that he wanted to negotiate was immediately rebuffed by the White House. There's no point in negotiating with him. You said it. You can't trust anything he says. I think, on the contrary, I'm sure he is a very manipulative, cynical person, formed as I was in the Cold War. But I see no evidence that he doesn't keep his word.
Yeah, and the what we're really up against here. There's a couple of headlines in articles in both the Washington Post and the New York Times this morning, which cover two different aspects of a real problem. This first one here is that the way the headline is written here, that Trump talks with Gabbard about U.S. defense reflecting isolationist approach. Of course, if you know anything about what Gabbard and it talks about Doug McGregor, and they're also what they're talking about is anything but isolation. It's a sane foreign policy that is restrained on all of these, always going everywhere with the military first. But the way it's characterized is anything besides the current approach is isolationist. Then in the New York Times, you have another piece where the former commanding general of CENTCOM is saying it's not time for our troops to leave the Middle East. And that means ever. If it's not time now, there's no valid purposes we keep talking about over and over on this channel But nobody wants to leave anywhere ever, whether it's NATO, whether it's the troops we have in Syria, in Iraq, etc. And so the idea of negotiating anything to where somebody besides us gets an outcome that's acceptable to them, I think is going to keep us trapped in an area where eventually, Mr. Ambassador, I fear we're going to back ourselves into a corner where we have to pay a price for this, not just making some bad decisions.
I think we're beginning to pay a price. Our credibility internationally has suffered greatly. We may see ourselves as having united NATO, but in fact, NATO members are all hedging against the possibility that we will abruptly abandon them. One of the problems I have with Mr. Trump's approach is he doesn't seem to put any value on consultative relationship with allies, the mutual management of a change in the relationship to conform to the new circumstances in which Europe can pull its own weight. He just supposes to, he's going to go run away from obligations the United States has undertaken. I think Article 5 in NATO is a very serious plank. I note that the only time it was really invoked was after 9/11, when Europeans offered and came to our aid. And I don't think you should casually abandon that. The American word needs to mean something. If we say we will do something, and here I am with President Biden, we say we're going to do something, we need to do it. We shouldn't make casual promises we can't fulfill, but if we make promises, we should stick with them.
Yeah.
So I think a responsible foreign policy in the new circumstances involves an adjustment in our relationship with Europe, not an abandonment of Europe.
Yeah.
And it involves a negotiated mutual adjustment, not a unilateral adjustment. Now, I guess I'd say also that, isolationism was very real. Between the World War I and World War II, we were dominated by isolationism. What did it consist of? It consisted of keeping our distance from world affairs, not, in fact, exercising our power to direct them or shape them at all. So we sat out World War II until the Japanese foolishly attacked us at Pearl Harbor. And Hitler even more foolishly declared war on the United States. We did nothing while Britain burned for 2 years. And the second point of isolationism was, even as we refused to exercise our power and did not build military power to back our an active diplomacy if we had one, we were moralizing. We're better than you. You guys are all a bunch of crummy foreigners, and you're doing stupid things, and you're all under the control of terrible people. And here we are, saintly, self-righteous, and so on. So we were morally very self-righteous, and in terms of practical power, almost not on the stage. That was isolationism. That is not what anybody's talking about now.
Right.
That was the debate when NATO was brought into being by Senator Taft and Senator Vanderbilt and others who asked whether the United States should be engaged internationally. And we concluded we should be. And I think we still should be, but not in the same way
exactly
that we started the Cold War. And I think we're hearing a lot of nostalgia for the Cold War because it was simple.
Right. Right.
We didn't.
We're right on the verge of nuclear war, but hey, it was easy.
Yeah, we are suffering from two things. One is enemy deprivation syndrome, which is the sick feeling you get when your enemy irresponsibly drops dead on you.
Yeah.
And you don't have an enemy to orient your foreign policy. So you got to invent enemies. So you demonize Putin, Russia, you demonize China, you demonize Iran. And maybe you don't have to demonize North Korea because it's pretty demonic already.
Right. Yeah. So that is one of the biggest issues to me, is that we don't want to think about what we want to do. We don't want to think about policy. We want easy. And so since we've been deprived of our Cold War adversary where it was easy, now it's a little bit more complicated. So we have to be a little bit more creative in coming up with that. But, one of the ways that we do that is to keep that enemy going up there. And you have this from David Petraeus. I believe Gary's got that queued up there. Check this out.
Keep in mind that Russia, first of all, would never stop if they achieve their objectives in Ukraine. Moldova, Lithuania, a NATO member would be next.
Just to put an exclamation point on that, you're saying is they would not stop. This whole, they'd be happy if everyone would negotiate and settle for a couple provinces in the Donbass.
This is complete nonsense. He has never stopped. His goal since taking office increasingly has been to reassemble as much of the former Soviet Union or Russian Empire as he can.
Now, I'll tell you, from a military perspective, it's just like fingernails on a chalkboard to me, because I'm like, on the other hand, at the same time, people are talking about how pathetic Russia is, that they've got this army that can't do anything. They've only got like 17% of Ukraine after 2 full years of war, when Ukraine has no navy, no air force to speak of, and no on the ground allies. But he's going to go then into a 32-member alliance that has a powerful Air Force, Navy, nuclear weapons, and all that. I mean, it beggars just any kind of credibility. But you see, he keeps going on CNN, and you saw the anchor there. She was buying it. Oh, wait, so you mean Putin's not going to be satisfied? That's what we're up against.
So let's review what actually happened. Mr. Yeltsin was succeeded by Mr. Putin. And Mr. Putin, in the interview with Tucker Carlson, very accurately reflected his conversation with Bill Clinton when he said, could I join NATO? Could Russia join NATO? Could we be part of a pan-European security arrangement in which we, like others, joined with others in common security enterprises? And apparently Bill Clinton said, well, that's very interesting, then went away and was talked out of it by the neocon establishment, and came back and said, can't do it politically. This was not an effort by Mr. Putin to expand into Eastern Europe or conquer Western Europe. So from a political and diplomatic point of view, David Petraeus is totally out to lunch. That is not what happened. Second, it is the case that, as you pointed out, that militarily, after 2 years, the Russian army has not conquered more than 17-18% of Ukraine. Now, why is that? One reason is that this is not a war of conquest. It is what Mr. Putin called it, a special military operation. It was intended to achieve clear diplomatic, political objectives, the neutralization of Ukraine, the removal of the anti-Russian extreme ultranationalist fascist element from Ukrainian leadership, and finally the restoration of the rights of the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine. These were the objectives. He's stuck with those, and he has not put the level of force into Ukraine that he could have. I mean, we may say the Russian army began this war demonstrating all sorts of weaknesses. Those weaknesses have been overcome. They have learned. Yeah. And, we should note that much of the fancy weaponry that we have designed turns out to be not very effective on the battlefield.
Right, and, that's a separate issue.
This is a problem. There is something to be said for simple stuff that can be fixed by troops in the field. It doesn't have to be shipped back to Dearborn or wherever it was made. So I think David Petraeus is just voicing the official narrative. It's propaganda. It's not analysis. It's beneath him. He's a smarter man than that, and he should recognize that he is mouthing a line, not developing objective information.
Yeah, well, he may be smart, but he's got some other issues, because that's a pretty consistent message he has. Well, Mr. Ambassador, I'm so grateful for you coming on today and kind of talking about some of these things. And I especially love your comment about that we need to evolve our relationship with Europe, not just abandon it and end it by any means, because that isn't in our national security. I think an argument can be made there, but we also can't just continue on with the status quo and blind ourselves and tell us that everything is going to be fine forever and we should do whatever Europe wants. We shouldn't, but we'll have to see if we can find a fertile field for that in Washington for somebody to actually put that into effect. But at least by coming on to Daniel Davis Deep Dive here, we know what a good path would be. So we thank you very much for coming on today.
We need to be both intelligent and responsible, and it's not impossible.
It is not. It is absolutely doable if we get the right people in charge. And that's a separate issue. But we thank you for coming on, and we thank you guys for joining us too. You want to come back on, I believe at 1 o'clock today, we have Matthew Ho, and he's going to kind of give us an update of what's going on with that other really horrible situation going on with the Israeli-Hamas war. You're not going to want to miss that. And I'm going to talk about 3 p.m. this afternoon on another show where I'm going to try to contain myself because I've got a lot of issues about what that Washington Post article we put up earlier showed about so-called isolationism and what people are saying about that. I'm going to discuss this from a military and veteran point of view. We're going to have a number of voices on there. You're going to want to tune in on that one because that one's something that's really exciting. I've got a bone to pick with some people, and you're going to want to join us. Thanks, and we'll see you this afternoon at 1 and 3 p.m. And until then, we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.